Welcome to Autism ADHD TV. It is the place to be for parents and professionals. I'm your host, Holly Blanc Moses, the mom psychologist who gets it. We dive into all kinds of important information like behavior, social skills, and learning. All right, let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Karen Wilson, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly. It's great to see you again.
It is so good to see you. I'm going to introduce you real quick.
Sure.
Dr. Karen Wilson is a clinical neuropsychologist, director of West LA's neuropsychology, and the founder of childnexus.com, a digital platform that connects parents whose children struggle with learning or social emotional issues with professionals who provide psychological and educational support services. Dr. Wilson is also the host of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast, which I'm a big fan of. So thank you again for coming on today with me.
Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's an important one because on the Autism ADHD podcast, we're going to be talking about learning differences because we do know that many children diagnosed with autism and or ADHD will be diagnosed with a learning disability.
Absolutely. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of what we call in the clinical arena comorbidity. So, we know, for example, that kids with ADHD, 50% of them also struggle with a learning disorder like dyslexia. And, we'll talk about this later on, but that's why it's so important to really understand why a child is struggling so you can provide the appropriate level of support.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And, it's not always easy.
It's
there's not this sort of, moment in time where we say, oh, this child definitely has a learning difference. But really, there are some signs that we can take a look at. And it gets tricky because it's not always early. It's not, again, this clear indication, for instance, in preschool or kindergarten. It could even be later. But some signs that we do notice, and I notice in my patients, mm-hmm. is work avoidance, mm-hmm. putting their head down, maybe challenging behavior to avoid work, even, copying off their peers. Right?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
And those. Mm-hmm.
Also, I hear a lot is I'm stupid. This is too hard. I can't do it. And then meltdowns occur.
Absolutely. And I see this a lot and I hear this a lot from parents. And those behaviors that you're describing, putting your head down, trying to avoid work, acting out, all of those behaviors can lead to mislabeling, right? Because then kids get described as behavioral problems or being non-compliant or being oppositional or being defiant, when underneath those behaviors is really a struggle. The child is struggling with, understanding material in the classroom, demonstrating what it is that they know, and they don't know how to let teachers know that they're struggling or they're embarrassed.
Exactly. And it's hard to explain. If you're a child and you have learning differences, it's not so easy to say, it seems like this is harder for me than everyone else.
Right.
I think I need testing. They're not going to say that. I mean, they're, like you said, they're going to feel embarrassed and maybe they're going to feel like something is wrong with them. And why does it seem easier for the other kids? If a child is having to consistently try harder, mm-hmm. or you're seeing these other signs, it's definitely something we want to do earlier than later, because you can see, like you said, they can be mislabeled, right? It's this child's non-compliant, they're oppositional. Well, no, it turns out that we missed a way we needed to support them and they need accommodations in school, but you can see how this is easily missed.
I can, and I see it all the time. And, not only, and when we miss it, we miss the opportunity to help them and to give them the support that they need. And when, we don't identify the source of the struggle and the struggle continues over and over again, semester to semester or grade to grade, then that can put kids at increased risk for low self-esteem, for depression, for anxiety. And oftentimes we can, prevent and mitigate the risk for those psychological issues if we can identify the source of the struggle early on.
Definitely. Something I also hear a lot, our kids are told, but you're smart, you can do this. Again, you just need to try harder. But it's important with learning differences to understand most kids with learning differences have an average IQ.
Absolutely. And I often tell kids it's not about being smart. You can be smart and still struggle. And it's important for parents and educators to understand that as well. And kids struggle in different areas in different ways. And when you talk about kids being missed, oftentimes those are the kids that are smart and they're able to compensate for their difficulty for a longer period of time. And it's not until those academic demands start to increase and things get a little more challenging that they can fall apart. And then people really don't understand what's going on, because it was like, you were doing fine. What happened? Maybe you just need to try harder. Maybe you're not trying hard enough. And that's absolutely untrue, for most kids that I see.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that's where it gets really confusing. Some kids, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, some children in high school don't find out they have a learning difference until, again, they're even gifted sometimes and they're compensating, but then it gets past what they can compensate for. And I've even seen college students be diagnosed as well. So, I mean, there's not a cut and dry easy way to identify, but if we pay attention and really look at those signs and not go straight to they're choosing not to try, or they're not trying hard enough, or they're just being disruptive in class, if we step back and think, what could be happening here? Why would they want to avoid this? I think it can take us in a whole nother direction of helping.
I think that's key. And I love that you pointed out the fact that this can be identified later, as late as high school or as late as college, because I taught at the college level for 15 years and I've seen it there as well. And I think that also contributes to society's, being more suspicious of ADHD. It's like, really, you're just getting diagnosed in college and now you want extended time. And so I think it's really important to educate people about it, because there's still that belief, and for many people, that it's not real and it doesn't really exist.
Right. And I always talk about that I want to get a t-shirt that ADHD is real.
Yes.
And parenting doesn't cause ADHD either. That's going to be maybe on the front and the back. That's what I'll have. That way I can cover it all. So let's look at the specific learning disorders. Let's first talk about the specific learning disorder with impairment in reading.
Sure. And, for most kids, those difficulties with reading are identified early on, first grade, because that's when kids are really learning to read. And these kids who really have a disorder in reading are not catching on as quickly as their peers, and they're struggling more than their peers. But like we've been saying, sometimes those reading difficulties aren't diagnosed until kids are much older. I've seen and diagnosed kids with dyslexia as late as 6th grade because they were missed. And it's really when kids struggle more with reading than their peers, despite adequate instruction. So they've received the same instruction as everyone else, but they're having more trouble kind of understanding phonics, understanding the sounds that go with letters, stringing those sounds together, reading fluently, reading accurately, and it's impacting their ability to really access their curriculum. And so it's not laziness. It's not, not having a good teacher. It's really a difference in the way their brains are wired that's leading to their brain to process that information in a different way.
And thank you for breaking that down, because like you were saying with reading, we have to really be careful and be looking on, those ages where they're really starting to read, they're expected to read more and more. And if we don't identify that sooner, then I'm a bad reader.
Right.
I can't read. And every time they go to read, there's probably going to be anxiety associated with that. Then you're going to be graded on reading and reading comprehension. And then when your grades are poor or less than your peers, you start to feel bad about that too.
Absolutely. And we need to read to access all the other subjects as we get older, right? If you're taking a science test and you can't read, then it's no longer a science test, right? And so we have to understand that reading is a gateway to understanding all the other material that we need kids to know and learn when they're in an academic setting. And so, early intervention is key, because we know that we can retrain the brain to read in a more efficient way, but we have to identify it early in order to have the best outcomes for kids.
Definitely. And like you said, it just keeps getting harder. So history comes, there's more information to read, there's more information
Absolutely.
to remember. And again, it just keeps getting harder. So let's talk about the specific learning disorder with impairment in written expression. I think this is a big one.
Right. And, that can go hand in hand with a specific learning disorder in reading, because if you can't read because of difficulties with phonological processing, then you also can't spell. And so it's very difficult to write, particularly when you have kids who, again, are bright, have all these ideas in their head, and then the teacher says, okay, we'll write it down. And then they have the paper in front of them, they have the pencil in their hand, and they have all the ideas in their head, but they don't know how to spell the words. And so what you'll see oftentimes is they will write as little as possible, or like we've been discussing, they will avoid, they will procrastinate, they'll wait till the last minute. And we lose the ability to really tap into all of those great ideas that they have in their head because of the difficulty with writing. And for some kids, it's not tied to phonological processing. For some kids, it's tied to executive functioning. They know how to spell the words, they know which words to use, so their language is fine, but they can't organize it. They can't organize the information, or they don't even know where to start. That task initiation is an executive function. And so they don't even know where to start. They don't know how to organize it. They don't know how to plan what it is they want to write about. And then they get frustrated or overwhelmed, and they also avoid, but for a different reason.
Exactly. And this is actually what I see quite a bit of in my practice, is parents will come to me and say, they're really concerned their child is kind of shutting down. And they're also having difficulty communicating what's happening for them. I mean, obviously there's a problem here. This child is anxious and feeling overwhelmed, but why? Where all their peers seem to know what to do. And like you said, if they are receiving instruction that's sufficient, just like all the other kids in class, why are they struggling so much more? And then with that organization, once you get older, like I mentioned earlier with the reading, there is more writing expected. You're having to organize the ideas in your head before putting them down. And sometimes that can be a big stopping point for kids. It can feel impossible.
It really can. And, we talked about this before we got on the call, but, it can lead to embarrassment and to frustration because, I have two kids, 7 and 9, and I've been to school open houses where everybody's work is on the board. And you go around and everybody, is kind of oohing and aahing at their work that their kids are doing. But for some kids sitting in that classroom, having their work on the board and on display is embarrassing for them because they can see their weakness, and their weakness is, out there for everyone to see. Everyone can see that they wrote 3 sentences and their peers wrote 3 paragraphs. And so we have to be mindful of kind of the social emotional toll that these difficulties and these struggles can have on children and adolescents.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I had an similar experience as a parent going in to an open house, and it was for my 12-year-old when he was younger, and everybody's work was displayed up on the wall. And again, you could pick out his work from everyone else's. It looked nothing like any of the other kids. It was hard to read. It was a lot shorter. The sentences weren't punctuated correctly. He was embarrassed. And he told me that. He's like, Mom, just don't look up on that wall. And when you think about it, and I asked him to take it down, by the way, after that, because I do not want him to feel bad about something that he didn't do on purpose. He really did try as much as he could. And that was really translating into, I can't write. Right.
And, for some kids, again, it can be even with art. It doesn't even have to be with written expression. Some kids have, a motor coordination disorder, which makes, drawing and coordinating their movements to draw and do artwork hard for them. And so, you might say, well, I'm not putting their writing assignment on the board, but I'm putting everybody's artwork. And that can still be embarrassing for some kids who have these fine motor issues that impact writing and also the ability to draw and do some artistic tasks.
Right. And I think a big part of that too is everyone understanding those differences. So that child is knowing that they are smart, they are good at so many things.
Yes.
They aren't bad at this. This just requires some different teaching and different learning. Because we don't always want to say, okay, we're just not going to have our kids, work up if they wanted to be up there, but instead say, I am going to let you decide, what you want. And if you want it up there, great. If you don't want it up there, that's great. It's whatever feels comfortable to you, but you did amazing. So really changing it instead of this is messy, you can do better.
Right.
Which I've read in comments on his work before. But instead looking at it in a very different way, and that way they can as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it really comes to self-advocacy, and oftentimes parents need to advocate for their kids. Like you said, you went and you told the teacher to take it down. And oftentimes parents don't feel that they can ask the teachers that, but they can, right? And students, as they get older, I think self-advocacy is such an important skill to help kids develop, because then they can be the ones to say and tell their teachers, I don't want you to put my work on the board. And that's really empowering for a number of students.
Definitely. So let's talk about specific learning disorder with impairment in math.
Right. And so those are kids who struggle with different aspects of math. And sometimes it can manifest as difficulties learning your math facts, those multiplication tables. And for others, they know kind of the basics of math, addition, subtraction, multiplication, but then they get it in the form of a word problem and they have no idea what to do. And oftentimes that's tied to a difficulty with language because they don't understand what the question is asking them. And so that can lead to difficulties again with solving math word problems. And, we talked a little bit about people struggling in different areas, and that's why it's so important to understand why a child is struggling, because a child can struggle with math for so many different reasons. One can be, they just can't learn those math facts. They may have difficulty with long-term memory, so they can't remember all of those multiplication tables because it's just not sticking. For others, it's tied to a language-based issue, so they can do math calculations with no difficulty, but they can't do math word problems because they don't understand what operation the question is asking them to solve. And then, for some other kids, they can have some visual spatial difficulties, which cause them to kind of line up the numbers when they're doing those long division problems, and then they make careless mistakes. And sometimes that can be tied to attention issues. And for others, it can be a working memory problem where they know how to solve the problem, but they're doing some of those mental math problems in their head, and they're making errors because they can't hold all the information in their head and also kind of manipulate it in the math problem at the same time. And so then they make errors. And so again, we have to really understand why the child is struggling with math. Is it a long-term memory problem? Is it a working memory issue? Is it a language-based struggle? Or is it a problem with attention, that they're just making careless mistakes? Because each of those is going to have a different intervention in terms of knowing how to support that child who's struggling.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it really does matter what type of struggle it is. And like you said, it's not, oh, they're having, they have a disability in math, we're going to go ahead and put in this intervention. Well, there's more to that. And that's where you really need a great and experienced evaluator, right?
That is true. That is true. Absolutely. Because again, we want to understand, exactly what is the source of the struggle. And I use the example for math. I could use the same example for reading or writing in terms of where are things breaking down, because that's where the intervention has to take place. And it makes no sense to attribute a child's reading comprehension problems to difficulties with attention. If they would just focus, then they would understand the material, when it's really a language issue that needs language therapy. And so we have to understand, again, and that's my soapbox, we have to understand the reason for a child's struggle so we know how to support them and help them moving forward.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. Well said. Something that we see, a bit of a common profile with my patients, is differences in processing speed and working memory, which you already mentioned earlier. Well, let's talk about working memory and take a closer look at what that looks like and why it's important to understand.
Yeah, so working memory really refers to the ability to hold information in your head and manipulate that information, or hold it in your head while you're doing other things. And oftentimes, it can lead to forgetfulness, because you may, for example, a child might get instructions. I want you to go upstairs, put on your pajamas, brush your teeth, and then get your book that you want to read. And they're trying to hold those things in their working memory, but they may get distracted, and they may lose that information that's they're holding in the working memory. Then you go upstairs and they're sitting on the floor playing with Lego. It's like, I thought you were supposed to be brushing your teeth. And they're like, oh yeah. And oftentimes it can lead to remembering, but you're remembering at the wrong time. For other kids, it really impacts their ability to do math problems, particularly when they're doing math word problems in their heads. Because you say, Johnny had 3 apples, his mother gave him 2 more, and then he dropped 1. And then they're like, how many did he have? How many did his mother have? How many did he drop? They can't hold all that information in their working memory. And it leads to difficulties with being able to solve those kinds of problems. Because again, the working memory is holding it and then manipulating it in some way. And so those kids really need scratch paper, they need manipulatives, they need those kinds of supports in order to be able to solve those types of problems.
Definitely.
Yeah, and it can impact reading as well, and it can impact reading comprehension, because if you're reading a story and you have to hold all that information, who the characters are, what their relationships are with each other, what they're doing, what is the plot telling me, where is this going? And while you're reading chapter 2, you have to hold all the information from chapter 1 in your working memory to know kind of what the context is for what you're reading right now. And so it impacts so many aspects of things that we do and we expect kids to be able to do in their daily lives, from learning, from having conversations. You have to hold information in terms of, what did that person just say to me? And what does the other person say? And how is that related? And now I'm thinking about, what I want to say to chime into this conversation, but I'm holding all that information in my head. And that can impact your ability to carry on conversations. And to participate in conversations in a way that you really want to.
Oh, that's so true. And so you just said about 1,000 fabulous things.
I really did.
That I can't remember all the things that I wanted to say. So a few things I was thinking about.
Yes.
Sometimes when I'm working with a child, not sometimes, a lot of the time, I'll hear, well, they're interrupting me a lot. They'll
Mhm.
interrupt. Well, that often comes from a fear of not remembering. If I don't say this now, I'm not
Mhm.
going to remember to tell you later.
Right.
And it looks like interrupting, it looks rude, it looks disrespectful, but really it's coming from a working memory difference where they're right. They're probably not
Absolutely.
going to remember what they wanted to tell you. And we'll do like different interventions. We're going to write that down. I love little notepads and all these little things that we can do to support kids so they can remember, because what they want to say is important. But a lot of times they also know that they're going to forget. Another thing you mentioned too is when maybe you're giving them verbal
Mhm.
instructions and it goes one, they say one in one ear and out the other because
Right.
they don't remember. And not only that, the parent starts to get frustrated, which is also understandable. And so oftentimes we're going to have to look at that in a different way and looking at it as a learning difference, as a brain difference, to where we have to not only say, but also write down or
Right.
draw it, and maybe not have all the steps at first. Maybe we have to, have that as a goal to work towards, but really looking at one simple instruction in the same room with them, maybe showing them first and then having them do it. I mean, there's lots of different ways that we can help in that area, but we want to make sure that we're not jumping too far, because that just leads to frustration to both the child and the parent. Um, the other day, Karen, I was trying, I'm 47. My memory is not what it used to be. I was trying to remember a number, and I was reading a number, but also trying to remember it in my head.
Mhm.
And I really struggled. I actually had to do it a couple times. And
Right.
I thought, I can't even imagine what
Oh
this
yeah.
is like to be in school and have a specific learning disorder in I mean, it's so hard to think about what's in your head, but like you also said, manipulate what's in your head
Right.
and then turn it around and then do an action with it and have to write it down.
Absolutely.
Extremely difficult for me, and I don't have a specific learning disorder.
Right. Well, that
When we think about working memory, we really have to consider that when we're getting frustrated with our students and with our children, is if there is an expectation they're not meeting, we need to step back and look at everything.
and that's why accommodations are so important, because if we understand that it's a working memory issue, then again, like you were saying, we can provide them the support that they need, breaking down those tasks into smaller chunks that are more manageable, providing some kind of visual guidance in terms of what they need to do. And so, but it's again, it comes down to understanding that that is really the source of the struggle. And it's not that they didn't care enough to remember the information. It's that it's really tied to their difficulty with working memory.
And I was so glad that my 17-year-old kind of gotten, a little frustrated with me the other day, which was well deserved, because I asked him and I said, Christopher, I want you to take out the trash and then put away your shoes.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he goes, I'm not going to remember that, Mom. I thought, you know what? Thank you for telling me. I was
Right,
feeling rushed myself and I wasn't thinking that through when I
right,
asked you to do that. I'm going to go ahead and write it down.
absolutely.
Um, and
And this,
so I think it's important for us to really help kids to tell us, what is harder or what might be difficult for them, because we're not always paying attention. Like I said, I understand his learning differences and I wasn't paying attention in the moment.
right. And the thing is with working memory is that we all will have difficulties with working memory when we're trying to hold too much in our heads. That is absolutely true. And so we know what that feels like. You know what it feels like when you have a number of things you need to do. You have to go to the grocery store. You haven't made a list and you have 7 things that you need to go in. You just want to rush in, rush out. you're thinking about what you need to do afterwards. You're thinking about an assignment that you have to do. Then you walk in, you get your groceries, and then you come out to the car and you're like, oh, I forgot the lemons and the rice, right? That's a working memory fail, right? And it's because you had too many things to remember and you're holding too much in your head and you were doing too many things at the same time. The same thing is true, and we probably all had this experience, I know that I have, with working memory, with parking your car in a mall parking lot and then going in, having lunch, doing a bunch of other things, and then having to come out and be like, hey, where's my car? You know, and then you see the person who has their car alarm and they're going up and down the aisles trying to hear that beeping sound for their car. That's a working memory issue, but that person had too much they were holding in their working memory at that time. But for people with real working memory struggles, those tasks are, you know, it's exacerbated for them and it impacts, you know, so many aspects of their lives.
Exactly. And again, like you said, that's one example. And imagine
Right.
how frustrating that is, and that happening all the time with almost everything.
Absolutely.
That's really hard. I tried to get into somebody's car the other day that was, but I will say it was very similar to mine.
Okay.
But I literally tried to open the door, could not figure out why it wasn't working. So and I was not even parked by it, by the way, like my car was in another area of the parking lot. But those things are so important. I know even with self-help skills, you know, we're teaching my son, my high schooler, to cook. Well, there are lots of steps in that, and you've got to turn off the stove when you're done. That's kind of a big deal. So, you know, this really can significantly impact kids, and we have to be mindful about it. And like, you know, we were saying earlier, approach it in a different way. So let's talk about processing speed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The thing about processing speed is that it often co-occurs with a number of the, you know, learning disorders that we've talked about, and with ADHD. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, their kids' brains, adult brains are wired differently, and it takes them longer to process the same information. And so, you know, sometimes it can be tied to difficulties with reading, because if you have a struggle with sounding out words, it's going to take you longer to read. If you have problems with working memory, you're going to be checking and rechecking your math facts to make sure that they are correct, and it's going to take you longer to solve that problem. For other kids and for adults, you know, their brains are just wired differently, so their brains are processing the information in a different way. The brain is taking a different route to process that information, and it's not the most efficient route. So it's taking those individuals, those kids, longer to complete tasks. For some kids, it's tied to executive functioning, where it's really, you know, it starts with a task initiation problem. It takes them longer to get started on a task because they don't know where to start. Or once they do start, they don't know what the next step is because of, again, we talked about problems with planning and organization. So that research paper, that book report, takes them so much longer to complete than it takes their peers. And so we really need to, again, provide the appropriate level of support for those kids. And it's not enough to just say we can give them extended time, because oftentimes they need to know how to use that time. You know, what are they doing? Are they just going to sit there and just look at the blank sheet of paper? Or do you want to cue them to check for errors, to make sure that they've completed both sides of the paper? Because I've seen kids who, you know, will complete one side of the paper, think they're done, and then they're handing in the papers and it's like, oh, it was two-sided, right? And so we want to make sure that we're providing them with support on how to use that extra time. It's not enough just to give them the extended time.
I'm so glad that you mentioned extended time. That's a really popular accommodation in school. And again, I think it can be a really good one, like you said, if it's used for the way that child learns. Because again, what are they doing? Are they fiddling? Are they thinking about playing Xbox when they get home?
Right.
I mean, there could be a whole lot happening in
Absolutely.
that extra time that has nothing to do with the assignment at all.
That is so true. And I think that some kids are even embarrassed to ask for the extra time or to use the extra time when they have it. And that's why, you know, making sure that kids and adults and adolescents understand their learning profile, understand their strengths, understand their weaknesses, understand why they need extended time. And again, it's kind of tied back into that self-advocacy, so that when they are granted extended time, they're given extended time, that they use it and they're not afraid to ask for it when they need it.
Yes. And I think, again, that comes back to that self-advocacy and teaching children why, instead of you have extra help because you need it. Well,
Right.
why do I need it? Like, why do I go here? Why do I get pulled out? Or why is there a push in? Right. We really have to have those conversations in a way that that child understands that they are not broken, that they are not bad, they are not less than anyone else. They learn differently, and they should be taught in the way they learn.
Absolutely. And what I always tell kids when, I'm sitting down and I'm going over their learning profile with them is that we all have things that we're really good at, and those are our strengths. And we also have things that are harder for us. And we have to work harder at those things. And that's true for every person, whether or not they have a diagnosable learning difficulty or not, right? And I know we all see it in our own lives. I have struggles with, kind of visual, spatial, parallel parking, understanding, north, south, east, west when I'm driving. Someone say, well, just go north on this road. I'm like, okay, left or right? You got to tell me left or right. Don't tell me north and south. And so we all have our strengths and weaknesses. And I think that normalizes it for a lot of students.
I love that. And I think it's important that adults show that as well, like you said so beautifully. And so, Karen, I so want to come out and fly out there and hang with you, but you and I are going to need Google Maps if we go anywhere, because
absolutely,
I am the same way. My family says mom is never going to get there. If we're all talking, who's going to drive? Is mom going to figure it out? I don't know.
Right.
Because I'm one of those people where they tell you to go somewhere and you just go cell phones and everything. I'm the one
right.
who stopped at the gas station or called it on the payphone to find out where on earth I am.
Right. Right.
So when you're in school, and that impacts so many things, again, just educating others on it. I love the term learning profile. It doesn't sound judgmental to me. It sounds like everyone has one.
Everybody has one.
Everybody has one. What's your learning profile? Oh, this is easier for me. This one's a little bit harder. Oh, what's your learning profile? I love it. I say, let's start it. We're going to start a movement. What's your learning profile?
Absolutely.
And then own it. Yes. So good. Thank you so much for coming on with me. I always love having you and chatting with you. And I know that my watchers and listeners have learned so much in this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly. It's just such a great conversation. It's an important conversation. And we just got to keep having the conversations with more people. So thank you so much.
Definitely. So I know they're also thinking, where can I learn more about Karen? Where can I check out her podcast? So tell us a little bit more about the services you provide and how our audience can find you.
Absolutely. So I have a private practice in Los Angeles, and you can find that at westlaneuro.com. And if you click on About Us, you'll get information about me as well as the other clinicians who work in my practice. And I also have a startup where I'm really trying to increase the resources that parents have at their disposal and connect them with professionals who can provide services and support to families. And that's childnexus.com.
That's so lovely. And then tell us about your podcast.
Yes. So the podcast is actually tied to Child Nexus. So if you do childnexuspodcast.com, you'll have access to all the episodes. And it's really about increasing understanding of kids who learn and think differently, who have social and emotional challenges that impact their daily lives, and how to support them. And so I have a number of people who come on and talk about different topics. We talk about how to support families. Holly, you've been one of the guests, and our episode is going to air soon. And I'm really excited about that conversation being out there for everyone to hear. And so again, it's all really about increasing understanding, because when we understand, then we know how to help.
I love it. And thanks again so much for coming on. And I am hopeful that you'll come on again.
I would love that.
Yay. Okay. You take care, Karen. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
We will. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with someone. It may just be what they need to watch today. If you're a parent, I'd love if you came on over and joined our Facebook group, Autism ADHD Group for Parents. If you're a therapist or educator, come on over to our group, Autism ADHD Group for Therapists and Educators. You're going to find those links right down there in the notes. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and/or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.